Hello, we are here with Breaking Bread. Before I introduce you to our guests, here's a quote just for this episode. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. Soren Kierkegaard. Our guests today, two very special people to your host and to countless people in their community over the years for various reasons, starting with values, what matters most, family, and of course, a family business. I have the honor of introducing Hubert and Chris Vester for today's episode of Their Breaking Bread. And I've got a million questions, a million and one, but thanks for coming on the show, Hubert and Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Now, I'm curious about those early years. It's what, 94, 95? What, yeah, 94, 95, 96. What was some of the inspiration at that time to keep moving forward? As I imagine in the beginning, business isn't must not have been easy in the beginning.
No, it was pretty hard. Actually, I mean, we did a lot of sacrificing. A lot of sacrifices. Actually, a lot of sacrifices by our family. It was because we were taken away from some of the family time that we had in the past. But it was a full-on dedication to the business, but I was very fortunate. My spouse was a part of it, so our drive to and from work was an hour and 20 minutes each way. So we had time to gear up for the day and gear down for the day on the way back home. So, but we could share a lot of stuff just riding in our car back and forth. So, but we created a real family atmosphere. It was really a family get together almost every day.
I feel obligated to ask, what was the model of the vehicle?
Well, it had to be a Nissan because that's where we started.
and I'll answer the rest of that question because it displays who Dad has always been. It was a Nissan Sentra. It wasn't.
What's that? Yeah, what is that?
That's the basic entry level car. Like that was the entry level car. I mean, they've got the Versa now, which is one level below that. But yeah, it's a Nissan Sentra.
Chris, what do you remember early on?
Yeah, so I was in college when Dad bought into that particular. Like he had pieces of other dealership, but not an active operator until that one. And I was in college, and so I do remember. I remember a lot of things. So I spent weekends working there in parts and service from the very beginning, and even a little bit of sales because I had been selling at the first dealership. And there would be days where, like, especially on Saturdays, because in the beginning we were not open on Saturdays for service, so my Saturdays would be spent there on the sales floor, salesperson. But even in the marketing side of things, like designing the logo, I go back. I've got an old polo shirt from that dealership that I kept because that logo was my design, not for the nostalgia of it being the logo I designed. And so, yeah, I was there on Saturdays selling, but there was a lot of times where when we were looking at doing marketing and advertising, there was a involvement in what it should look like, the design, the layout of this carries us way back, newspaper ads. Yeah, I mean, so just being in and around, knowing that when it rained, the building leaked really bad. It rained inside as much as it did outside. I mean, it was
How many miles did you put on that car?
Well, we would get out of them. We never wanted to put too many miles on them because you couldn't retail them. So we had to stay under a certain mileage. So we would they would last us probably a couple of months, and that was about it.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
be mile them out. Then we'd retail it as a demo.
So it would take about 2 months to put about 3,000 miles.
We ran it about almost 5,000 miles.
5,000.
Yeah, it was a lot of miles.
What were some of those early?
Let me say something about
Yeah, go
his
ahead.
logo, and this is kind of in jest. It was a very distinctive logo. We called it the bullseye because from a long distance
Wow.
like that, so it was very distinctive. You knew what you saw. You didn't have to get up close to the car to say, okay, that's one of our car that we sold. You could see it from a distance, and you knew just by you just recognize it at a long distance. But back then we were doing newspaper, and it was a really hateful thing to get in an ad.
Oh, it was.
It was terrible
because it was a round logo in a square.
It was a round logo, yeah. So you're trying to put a round logo on a square peg.
Yes.
But it was
But
very
it
distinctive.
was memorable. Wow. What were some of the values that you think you crafted in your own self as a business person during that time?
Well, I was very disciplined. I disciplined myself, and I think that bled over to a lot of our people. I've always tried to be able to put myself in other guys' place. I had someone tell me one time, actually one of my mentors was my mentor, that he said, you have the ability to speak to the janitor and also the president of the company and everybody in between. And I've always tried to be able to relate to whomever I'm speaking with, on their level. But I think the work ethics, I remember early on, before we even got into the car business, I mean, I've been self-employed since I was 21 years old. Even in those early days, I know some of my friends, on a Saturday was looking to, let's go to the lake, let's do this, do that. But I had the discipline that said, no, I'm going to work. So, I mean, it's just a work discipline. But I think as far as is when we did that dealership, I think the people saw that from the beginning. We did the physical labor. As Chris said, it rained in that building. It didn't rain on it. It rained in it when it rained, but it's the only building available. When we bought that dealership, they had no building. It was in a open field, with a 4x8 plywood sign. So we started from nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing. A few parts and maybe 20 cars total. So we had to find a location. But me and the guy that I actually ended up selling it to started with me on day one, and him and myself and my dad went down and did the physical labor to get that building operational, to get the premises where we could use it, even the outside premises where it looked like retail space. So I think they just saw that picture from the onset. I wasn't the ivory tower guy that just sit back and try to tell you what to do. I was in the mix. So I think that helped instill some of the values, some of our work values and core values.
Chris, what was the earliest memory you have of seeing Hubert work? Do you remember?
Yeah, it was way before the dealerships. It was when he was farming. Like we were farming. I mean, I wouldn't say it was a job. I had a responsibility even then, but I remember he was actively working farming. The responsibility I had was while I was watching him, because I mean, I was 5, so you can't go and do and everything with your dad when you're 5. And you're usually relegated. This is going to sound ugly, but you're relegated to where the women are, right? Because they're going to help take care of you while they work. So they were working, like my mom was working, actively working.
Wow.
But so dad's running the farming operation, usually moving tobacco from the field to the barn. Like was a lot of it. And we had, I don't even know if the people that are listening are going to understand it, but it was early tobacco barns. And you did it where the barn was heated with gas flame, but the tobacco was actually sewn onto a wooden stick, a 1x1 wooden stick. And it's almost like a big, long sewing machine. So you put tobacco down, you put a stick down, you put more tobacco down, and then the sewing machine sews it together. And then that stick goes into the barn for curing. So Dad was the guy that was bringing, like I'd say you and Granddad were spending most of the time taking the tobacco from the field as it got pulled off the stalk, primed. And then he'd bring it to us, and then he'd go back and get the next trailer. And then while he's gone, it was our job to get the tobacco in the barn. And so my first responsibility was the guy that put the stick on that. It's called a looper.
Cold looper.
Yeah. And so like I'm 5 years old, and it's just my job to make sure that the tobacco the stick gets there so that the tobacco can get sewn onto the stick.
Wow.
So again, I got to see Dad work, but the majority of my time was spent with the women, because usually the women were the one, and not because it was their job, it was just a different type of labor. Because you had young men usually in the barn, because it's way more labor intensive to be in the barn, that were hanging the tobacco between the rafters. So yeah, it was like I wasn't old enough to do that job, wasn't old enough to drive, but I was old enough to at least put a stick on a looper.
What do you think that taught you?
Well, like everybody had, it's hands-on from everybody. And then the other side of that, once the tobacco was cured, you're taking it out of the barn and getting it ready to go to the market or to the warehouse. And you're putting it in sheets, like these big, they call them tobacco sheets. It's a burlap sheet tied up. And my job there was, because I'm the littlest guy, they had a big round cylinder that you put on the sheet, and you put tobacco in that cylinder, and then you pull the cylinder off and you tie the sheet around that tobacco that's been packed into that cylinder. And I was the packer. Like I'm the little kid, agile enough to get in and out of the packer, not too heavy to crush the tobacco leaf, but enough to get it packed down. So, I mean, there's a role to be played. So everybody had a role. Again, it was usually I was there because the women were the ones that were tying the sheets up and moving. I mean, it was just like everybody had a role in the assembly. Wow. Somewhere in the assembly line, you had a place. So, and I didn't have a sister until I was 5 years old. So, I mean, that was the summer that my earliest memory of that probably was the summer that Stephanie was.
How old were you then, Hubert?
25.
What advice do you have for the 25, young, early 20s, mid 20s that have that level of responsibility that are listening to the show?
Well, I wouldn't advocate doing it to the extent that I did, because like I said, some of the family time was not available. I was working. So I wouldn't go to that extreme, but just try to have a work balance, but be dedicated and do something you're passionate about. Because if you're not passionate, you can't give it what it needs. But I'd say you just have to discipline yourself to be willing to do the job and stay focused.
And Jay, it's funny because he says he wasn't there for family, but I never looked as being there, putting a stick on a looper or packing the tobacco as not being family. Like it felt like that was from a 5-year-old's point of view. Like I didn't miss my dad. He was with me. I just had something to do in between of breakfast and dinner. Breakfast is at 5 o'clock in the morning, early, dark, outside. But I didn't, because it was a family operation and my grandparents were involved. Like, grandmama would come take out barns, and she wasn't working at the factory. And granddaddy was there every day at lunch. I got to have lunch with my family. Like my mom was there, my grandmama, my granddaddy, like everybody. I've eaten a lot of mashed banana sandwiches during the summer with with my whole family. So I didn't know any different. So I didn't know that wasn't quote unquote fun, because I was having fun. Because like I've got a little small trinket that I remember giving my granddad. And it's a little boy and an older gentleman, and they're fishing. They're sitting on the edge of a thing fishing. And the reason I gave it to him, because I was a teenager when I gave it to him, was because a lot of my memories were after lunch was over, we might have another 20 or 30 minutes, and he and I would go to the pond that was on the farm and we would fish until it was time to, lunch break was over. So, I mean, Dad says I wasn't there, and I understand what he's saying, but as the 5-year-old kid from 5 to 11, because we stopped farming when I was 11, that's just what family was. I mean, there was a earning of the roof over your head by participating in the family business, but I didn't resent it. I didn't like it a lot of times, but I didn't resent it.
Yep. And I go back to the question I asked too, Jay. My father-in-law, I respected him a great deal. Very smart individual. But it's one thing he told me has always resonated with me is just never blame anybody else for your failures. Always accept responsibility for it's up to you. And that leads back to where Chris is talking about the sticks and the loopers and those type of things. The guy that's working 40 hours a week, to me, he's got a 40-hour week job. Okay. But we were responsible, those barns where we had to put those tobacco in, I already had tobacco in it from the week before. So before you can even start putting it in, you got to take the other tobacco out. And that normally started and was completed by the time your normal regular all-day help arrived. So you were there first, and you had probably an hour or two job that had to be completed before they actually arrived on the scene. And then after the barn was emptied and refilled, everybody else goes home. Well, it's your responsibility. So back then you had to start the heat process on this tobacco. And you had to get all the excess stuff out of the barn from the day's work, get all the burners lit up. Usually there's about 16 of those, and half of them would not want to start up easily. And then you had to make sure all the aeration was right. So you had another hour or two after everybody left. So you had about a 4-hour longer work day than the people that was working for you. So you ended up, your day was longer than anybody else's. So you had to, yeah. A friend of mine, a very good friend of mine, in fact, we used to double date in high school together, and we still friends, and him and his wife. And I was complaining one day. He said, you baked the cake, now you got to eat it. So, I accepted that. I said, well, I baked it back then, but I was doing the eating with those extra 4 hours a day that no one else had to do.
How many days a week was that?
Pardon?
How many days a week was that?
Depending on the time, it could go anywhere from 5 days a week to 6 days a week. But during that process, you're working 7 days a week because the curing process never stopped. And then you had to prepare the tobacco to get it out of the barns. It's what we call the ordering process, because when you finish getting it cured out, it's very dry and brittle, and you couldn't touch it. It would just crumble into a million pieces. So you had to make sure that it was cured out and it was completely dried like it's supposed to be. And then you had to get it, what we call an order. So then you had to get moisture into the leaves so you could handle it. So it was a process, and normally that took place on Sunday.
Wow.
When we start back on that same, because it take a full week. So the barns and stuff you did on Monday last week was in the same rotation for this week, and you had to make sure that it was ready to make that transition.
So to give a lot of clarity on that, and it would depend on weather too. So if we got rain out a day or whatever, then Saturday would be a work day with staff. But for the most part, you had help, like labor help, Monday through Friday.
Yeah.
And then Saturday and Sunday was mostly dad.
And
maybe granddad.
Yeah, and a lot of time we would do abbreviated Saturday. We used to try to put in a couple barns a day. And usually sometime on Saturday, we just say, okay, let's do a barn. And we would do a barn on Saturday mornings.
But like Dad said, Sunday was, I don't ever remember working with help on Sunday.
No.
even then.
We would get,
we're not open on Sunday now. That's kind of always been a thing.
on Sunday, we were getting the barns ready to transition, and we were having to move the equipment from one field to another. So when the help got there on Monday morning, it was in the right place. So you had to be prepared for the week.
What would be the consequences if you didn't put in that effort?
It just fail.
Lose product.
Yeah, just fail.
It's inefficiency.
Yeah, it had to happen.
Well, it's a lot of pressure.
You gotta make it happen.
Are there lessons from the farming business that were adaptable to the automotive space?
Well, I mean, you had to, it's a lot of detail. I mean, when we were farming, there's a lot of detail in it. I mean, people think it's not, I guess, I'm not sure, but in all the crops that you grow, it's a lot of detail that goes into it. There's certain things have to happen at a certain time, even if it's a grain crop. There's certain times for fertilization periods and those type of things. So you had to work to a schedule and to a detail. And I guess actually my time, and because I spent some time in the insurance business, I actually learned more as far as the business side of the things than I did in the early years of farming. But that was mostly physical labor. I mean, you had to make decisions, but it was still a lot of physical labor involved in that, where the other was no physical labor, all mental work. And so, I mean, it's a different philosophy altogether. So I guess it helped in two ways. I wasn't afraid to do the work when we got into the car business, if I needed to go back and wash the car, it's okay. But on the flip side, you had to make sure you had your business running right.
Yeah, I'd say, and like I said, we got out when I was 11. So at that age, you're just observation more than anything. But the lesson I think that's there, like listening to Dad just now, is that process pays. I mean, there was like you had to understand the process of the timing of everything when it came to getting a crop fully mature and harvestable in a way that you got the most value out of the acre.
It was an absolute process.
Right.
Even I think back, what you just said queued me up. Even with the tobacco crops, Jay, you're fighting insects, and a tobacco stalk has what we call suckers. Okay. And what that is actually it's another, it's trying to reproduce. It's just nature. But between each leaf that's on that stalk, it's trying to grow another stalk. And so it'll sprout out a little, just another little growth. And if you didn't take care of that at the proper time, it would ruin your crop.
Wow.
Because it would be taking all the nutrients up that you needed to go into the leaf to get the quality and the poundage out of the tobacco that you needed to make. So we had to be spraying on a timely manner, and that was a process, and it was a schedule. Once you started that, and then it would have actually a bloom at the top, and we just called that the tops. But it's a beautiful flower, but it's sucking up all the nutrients. And so at certain period of time, you knew that your process, okay, and this is the time is to take that off. And so all the nutrients, you might want to make sure all the nutrients is getting to that leaf, that tobacco leaf.
How much room for error was in that business?
Not very much. No, if you
Wow.
missed it a couple of days, man, you lost.
Even it's funny because I watched them take down that crop across the street from us.
Mm-hmm.
We're on record of our wettest summer ever in our area, and because of the timing of that, it has ruined the crops, tobaccos in some, because it just took on too much water at the wrong time of its growth. There's just a lot in that process, and if that process gets interrupted, or you try to skip a step, or any of that, then you're going to be less efficient and get less yield per acre. And I think that when you look at this business, it's very process oriented, from the marketing and advertising as a process, the sales, is a process, like how we meet and greet the customer, you know, identify what they need and solve their problem, whether that's a sales customer or a service customer. There's a process. And if you skip any of that process, it's going to be less efficient. It's going to lead to a worse experience for the customer. It's a different kind of crop, but it's still a crop. Like that's when I'm sitting here listening to him, that's what's occurring to me. It's still a crop, you know? So you take the ability to grow a crop combined with the drive needed to develop a sales base, a customer base, you know, that's insurance sales. And you take those two things and it is automotive.
Yeah, kind of.
And
Actually, the timing on that tobacco too, talking about the wet year, we did have some years, because like I said, you just got a very short window in order to get some of these things done, and it would be too wet. You couldn't get your equipment into the field, and we have actually contracted these spray planes that will come over the fields and spray for some of these things just to make sure it was hit at the right time. And irrigation, I mean, at certain times of the crop, you knew when it was needing the water the most, and so that you irrigated, we make sure it had the water it needed at the time if you're having a dry year. So I remember back in must have been in the late 70s, I guess. We actually had a field that was that had the highest yield per acre anywhere in the county, and I remember they had me at what they call ASC office in our county, and asked me how we did it and what process we did to make that happen. And now it's more poundage making now than back then, but I think we made maybe 4,000 pounds per acre, and I think the average was 2.
Whoa.
So we almost had a double what the crop should have been at that time. So I had an interview process. They wanted to know what we did.
Yeah, he won an award. I was sitting here thinking that was the year I remember you being in the paper, that I took a picture of you in the field with the crop, and like the plants were almost as tall as you were.
Yep,
in that picture. Like, and Jay, I was probably 6 or 7 years old, and
wow.
But it was like best. I don't know. They gave you an award for that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we got Farmer of the Year.
Farmer of the Year. That's what it was.
Yeah.
Farmer of the Year, and he's 26, 27 years old. You know.
Wow.
I don't think they ever asked him where he got his seedlings from.
What was the inspiration to pivot to insurance?
What pivoted? Well, it was
a couple of move to insurance. Yeah.
It was a couple of things. We were I grew up poor and just didn't know it. We had fun. We had neighbors, and we had family that lived close by. So we grew up, maybe we had a tobacco stick, we were riding like a pony. But I mean, we were poor, but we just didn't know we were poor. And so I guess just coming up through some of that created some of that. I don't know, just the drive. And I've always liked to sell, Jay. I mean, I've always liked to sell. In fact, it's probably shouldn't say this, but when I was very young, I mean, first, second, third, fourth grade, I hated homework. It just was not that just felt my wheelhouse. I hated it. I thought school was a social event. So my granddad had a grocery store. I could buy a box of candy from him at a real discount, buying about a box. And I could take it to school and sell it and mark it up 300 or 400%. And I prepared to get one of my neighbors to do my homework for me.
Oh, there you go. Wow. Leverage.
So yeah, I was an entrepreneur at about the second or third grade.
Wow. Some of those early business lessons in the insurance space that you think have been valuable throughout your career, are there any that come to mind? Early insurance business lessons.
Well, we always looked at the type customer we were trying to get, because we looked at a lot of loss ratios, and we still look at our loss ratios here in some of our products that we sell. We're looking at loss ratios, And it was, you know, you didn't want to insure everyone. We wanted to make sure that the clients that we insured, I was looking at somebody that I felt like was a good operator and a low risk, because I didn't want to have a high loss ratio on my book of business. So, and it's kind of like an expense control, you know, because that's a loss is an expense. So we were always looking at our expense controls. And that helped me a lot, and just to understand the pure business philosophy behind some of those things.
Jay,
Chris,
you had
yeah, go ahead.
the question about the making the move from farming to insurance. I think at that time there was a lot of governmental shift in farming, and it was you either had to go big or get out.
And that was where we were at, because Chris didn't. He had no ambition to be into the farming. He had no. That was not a passion for him. And that was part of it. And we were at an odd size. We were at a point. We were fairly good size, but we were not huge. As I said, I came up poor, so I started with nothing. When I started farming, we didn't own any property, so I had to lease every bit of the property that we were on. Didn't have a first piece of equipment, so I had to go to the bank and beg, borrow, and get some money to get started with. But we were at a point we either needed to grow or go. And with them not having any passion in it, I said, well, the point to grow, it's not something he's going to want to do. So is this something I want to go out and just get bigger by myself? And I elected not to do that.
How many acres did you farm the last year? Do you remember?
Not total. We had 100 acres of the tobacco, which back then that was a big amount, and now people are raising 600-700 acres of tobacco. It's handled a lot different, a lot more efficiencies involved. But that was the key.
1,000 acres total.
Probably close to that. Corn, soybeans, sweet potatoes, and all that. Yeah,
decent size operation.
Wow.
Yeah, so I just chose to not do that, and went into the insurance business thinking, well, this is something I could do, and maybe he could find his niche, you know. And but I've always just liked selling. I like selling. It's just been a part of it.
Why was it important to do it together, or to include other people in the family?
I got involved with one later on, but actually it was something that we just did as a family for a long time. It was just important to me. We could do that. We could do that.
Why was it important to you, though? Some people, yeah, that might not.
Well, I mean, you want to do well, but you want to do well for your family. You know, I work for my downline. If that makes any sense. I can be happy easy. Doesn't take a lot for Hubert to be happy, but I want to make sure I just wanted to help make sure that there was something coming from the downside, from the downline.
Wow.
I'd love to see my great grandchildren do well.
That was important to you.
Yeah, but not necessarily a gift, but you like to see them take something and make something more of it. You know, I wouldn't want to ever entitle anybody to, just to sit back and read what we did, but give them something to work with.
I think we were able to go to David Green 2 years ago, and be at the headquarters of Hobby Lobby. And they've gotten crazy huge, but that's kind of the way he operates even in that space before that they decided to do what they did, which means that they sell the company that nobody gets anything. Like it's the way it's going to be split up. But as his grandchildren find their passion in something, he leaves it to them to go find initial funding. And as long as it aligns up with the values of the family, then they'll come alongside. So he gave them permission to dream, but not necessarily an obligation to be in the business. And I think that's what I've gotten from Dad. I mean, I've never felt obligated to be here. I've liked working in the space with my dad. Like I said, I didn't always enjoy the farming work, but I never resented the fact that I could be with dad, mom, and granddad and grandma, and like all the time. And he's right. I had zero interest in being in a tobacco field the rest of my life. Like I did not enjoy that part of it at all. But I did enjoy having family time. So, but probably watching him gave me permission to think bigger. You know,
Really? Why?
I mean, because I saw him build things. I mean, I mentioned the fact that he won that award as the young farmer of the year, farmer of the year for Nash County. But like his first year in insurance, he was a super high performer. So I watched everything he touched be successful. Right. So it gives you a picture of possibility of what could be with the right work ethic and the right vision and the right dream. Like you just see potential, you know, where I think a lot of people, if they've got nobody in front of them or nobody ahead of them that shows them potential, is the reason they don't find any potential in themselves. So I think it gave me permission to think big. I think that's probably been one of the things that irritates him is I think too big. Well, the reason I think so big is because he thought big.
Yeah. I tell you, just sitting here thinking and listening, I guess two words come to mind to me. And one is desire. You know, I had a person tell me one time, and it's so true, is you can measure a person's intelligence, but you can't measure a desire. You cannot
Wow.
measure a person's desire. And to me, I mean, I remember when I actually started farming, I had and drive, it's desire and drive, those two D words. But when I started farming, of course, now these combines are hundreds of thousands of dollars, a new one, $600,000 or $700,000 to buy one of these machines. But back in that day, I found a used one for $15,000. I remember exactly what I paid for it. I bought a tractor that was $9,000, but I bought this used equipment, borrowed the money from the bank, and that was when my buddies would come by. Let's go skiing. Let's go. And I said, no, I got to work. I got to work. But I had to drive and desire that very first year. I would pick corn for other farmers. I mean, I was just not just mine. I was working for other guys just to make the money. I remember I paid the bank back that entire amount the first year.
Wow.
But I remember driving that machine. In fact, I was picking beans somewhere, some soybeans for another farmer. And this was on a Saturday night. And this machine, I made a turn and the engine, the crankshaft blew. Those machines had a reputation, and the John Deere, it was a John Deere machine, they had sent out a recall and they put a harmonical balancer on the crankshafts. And somehow the machine that I had purchased never got through that recall. And so the engine went. This is on a Saturday night. Just about time that happened, it started to rain. So we had to take a tractor and pull this thing through the shop because it would not run. We pulled the engine out that night, made a trip to Maryland to pick up another engine, brought it back, and by the time it got dry enough to get back into the field, the machine was running. And luckily, John Deere paid the freight because they missed that machine. So they paid for that engine. But we never missed a single minute with that machine. Luckily, it rained that Saturday, so we couldn't go back to the field maybe till Tuesday. But we had a new engine in that machine and running by then. And it was not easy. But that took drive. It took desire. And like I say, it was dark when that happened on a Saturday night when most everybody else is out to dinner. But yeah, pay for that machine and that tractor in the first year.
Chris, for those in the with aspirations in the automotive space to be successful, what would you say they should take away from that story?
Desire and drive.
Yeah. I was gonna say
Because I'm happy to say I'm not quite that way today, but I remember when we first opened the store in Clinton, the Nissan store that we ended up owning outright. And this sounds bad, but I hated to see Sundays roll around because we didn't work. I enjoyed it that much. I enjoyed going to work. It was the most fun thing I could do. I enjoyed the people we had, the employee base there. They were all like family. It was almost we we had a lot of fun every day, and I was disappointed because I'm not going to work on Sundays. We're not going to ever do that. But I couldn't work on Sunday. But I had the desire and drive to make it happen. I mean, that little store was number one in the region at market penetrations. It was just phenomenal. But it was a family and a team effort. It wasn't just me. I mean, everybody was pulling the line. Everybody. If we had one person that didn't, he had a hard day, and not just from me. I mean, the people around him. It was that it was just a family thing. They call each other out, and if it was a weak link, he didn't last. It was actually hard to bring a new manager in because it was like a family bond, and they had to penetrate to be accepted in that ring. So it was tough to bring in a new person, but it was good. At least you know when you brought somebody in, if you brought a good one in, you had a winner. If you didn't, he wouldn't stay.
it's and we've talked about farming a lot. You asked me what's the takeaway. Yeah, I said process pays, but pruning is required for optimal yield. And what I mean, you heard Dad talk about, we called it topping and suckering. So you took the tops off and you pulled the suckers. And you did that, as Dad said, so that the leaves got the nutrients they needed. And what you heard him just describe is if somebody was there and they weren't performing, then they got pruned.
They got plucked.
But it didn't just happen by the upper half of management or the manager. Like, it would happen from those around them, because there was a level of expectation of, hey, if you're going to be here, you're going to help us produce. But that's a pruning process, So if you're looking for optimal yield, you've got to prune. And I think in business, that's one of the harder things to do, because it's people. It's one thing to take a top off of a tobacco stalk and take the suckers out of it, to recognize that it yields better. But when you get rid of a sucker, someone taking away nutrients, then the business will yield better. It's a extremely difficult lesson to learn, because you're talking about people. But I think it's and Dad and I've had this conversation a lot. It's, if you don't, then it's detrimental to the entire group, not just to that one family.
And sometimes they can sound cold, Jay, if you think about it, but if you're sacrificing the good of the group for the good of the one, it's not. You're being cold to your group. Not, you're not being fair to your group. So you got to look at it as a positive, that you're taking care of the whole, not the one.
Hmm.
And another philosophy I've had too, Jay, I've never, ever claimed to be the smartest guy in the room, ever. And in probably most rooms I'm not. But if there's something that you can do and it takes you 8 hours to do it, and it takes me 10 hours to do it, then I've just always had the determination, okay, to kick your butt, I'm going to work 12. You might get it in 8. Now I can do the same thing you can do in 10. So it puts me at 12, and I'm going to be doing that 12.
Wow.
Whatever
In
it takes.
closing, for this episode, is there a word that exemplifies this conversation that comes to mind? I'm curious what word that you each, yeah, is there a word that exemplifies a theme to this part of the conversation? Or, yeah.
I guess mine would be passion.
That's exactly.
That's terrible, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exact. I was getting ready to write it down. I was like, it's passion because
Oh, that's cool.
it's because everything Dad's ever put his heart into, I mean, people only put their hearts into things that they're passionate about. And you can't, Dad's right, you can't, like, there's no test you can take to measure drive and desire. But when someone's passionate, you can feel it. It's like a heat that comes off. Yeah, so like passion, that's exactly the word.
It's contagious.
Can be.
It can be contagious if it's displayed properly.
This was great. We just need some bread.
Yeah, I think next time
Yeah.
I'll bring a bread and we'll put some olive oil and balsamic vinegar in the middle, and we'll just just
Eat
take a
at the
couple of
end,
them.
yeah, right at the end. Just eat some bread. And for all you listening, thank you for breaking bread today with these two great men. And I'm excited to continue and hopefully keep the calories down as we continue breaking bread. And we will see you next time.
All right. Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, sir.